you in a couple of weeks, and it feels like it's been a month. I didn't preach that Sunday, so it's been like, this is like the third week. It's a short passage today. Don't worry, don't panic. Man, it is good to be with you. We're going to let kids go to kids' church. When I said I was doing my own thing, Ann, I wasn't leaving out. But it was just good to be here on the front row and hear you sing. Hearing you sing and being with you, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed your worship. 2 weeks from today, Tyler doesn't know this yet, 2 weeks today, we're having the Lord's Supper here. Needed to get that on the radar and get that in your mindset there. So that's a couple of weeks out. Something to pray for this week is a group of leaders from North Florida who, Andy Jordan, some of you have worked with Andy because he's been here several times, and neat guy, great leader that we just got hooked up with probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And he's bringing a group of pastors and state convention leaders from Florida this week. And they're going to be looking at how they can partner somewhere specifically in East Idaho, in a community that might not have a church, in a community that might be very underchurched. They'll be here to worship with us next Sunday, so that'll be kind of cool. That'll be fun. And have we talked about the association meeting? Hey, this coming Saturday at 10 o'clock here, we talk about the Eastern Idaho Southern Baptist Association every now and then, and the meetings are always, hey, it's going to be here this week. It's going to be here next Saturday, and you're more than welcome to come and join that, huh? Okay, this coming Saturday. It's the next one in the, 6 days from now, the Saturday of this week at 10 a.m., and there's no doubt that that's a business meeting. We do some business, but we also talk about what God's doing in Eastern Idaho. And my friend Jack Harwell will be preaching that day, and that's always a kick. That's always a kick. If you don't know Jack, he's been a pastor in Malad for almost 30 years because he's just honorary enough to stay there. And he's a good guy. He's a good guy. So I'm glad to be with you, church family, today. I'm glad to be back. And we're going to be in John chapter 18, verses 19 through 24. Last week, Tyler dealt with the denials of Simon Peter, as he denied even knowing who Jesus was, as he denied being a disciple of Jesus Christ. And tucked in the middle of that, in the context, are these verses right here, in 19 through 24, and it just gives us an idea, a little bit of the idea of the beginning of Jesus questioning the trial. I hate to use the word trial because it's out of order and it's not right the way they're doing things, but it still gives us a picture of that. Let's listen to these few verses and just take them apart a minute and then make a couple of observations about this text. John chapter 18, starting in verse 19. Inside, the high priest, when it says inside, outside, Peter has just denied Jesus the first time. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he had been teaching them. Jesus replied, everyone knows what I teach. I've preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. I've not spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said. Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. Is that the way to answer the high priest? He demanded. Jesus replied, if I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me? Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Just a few little verses in there. Just a few little verses in there that give us a picture. And if we're not careful, if we look closely at this passage, we might see something that looks confusing. We might say, that's some double talk or that's some confusing talk, and I'm not sure of it because it begins with, inside the high priest is asking questions. And it closes with, then Annas bound and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. And it's like, well, which one of them, what's going on here? 3 weeks ago now, I mentioned the fact, and it's good as a reminder so we understand this passage. This is not a contradiction in this passage. This is an understanding of history. Annas, I have to be careful that I get them in the right order. Annas had been the high priest. And a Roman official in AD 15 found him detestable and had him removed from his position. And he had enough political clout to do that, even though he was the high priest of the Jews. He had enough political clout to have him removed so that they could possibly have better relations with Rome and that kind of thing. So Annas was no longer, he's kind of the deposed high priest. And from that time until now, one of his relatives has served as the high priest. Do you hear a little stuff going on behind the scenes here? Currently, it's his son-in-law Caiaphas who's serving as the high priest. The role of high priest was an appointment for life. You didn't rotate every few years or something like that, right? So behind the scenes, the Jews still recognized Annas as their functioning high priest. But in public, Caiaphas carried out the political role. Does that make sense? So Annas is still functioning. So when they've arrested Jesus, they take him to, and I think I mentioned this before, even Josephus, the Jewish historian, continued to refer to Annas as the high priest as long as he was alive. So he's to the Jewish people, he's the high priest. And publicly and politically, at this time, Caiaphas is the face of the role. So when Jesus is arrested, they take him to Annas, who was the Jewish recognized high priest. And that's why these verses can talk about the high priest questioned him and then the high priest sent him to the high priest. Just a little bit of history, and it solves that mystery. I did not mean to make a rhyme, but there it was. That was not on purpose. I hope to never do that again. So let's look back at verses 19 and 20. I promise there's no more rhymes in this. If they are, they are a mistake. Let's look back at verses 19 and 20 and start this again and look at it. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he'd been teaching them. Jesus replied, "Everyone knows what I teach. I've preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. I've not spoken in secret." The arrest and the trial of Jesus. Again, I have a hard time calling it a trial because nothing is done in an orderly way. Okay, it's been said that I'm a nerd. And I've come to, don't shake your head yes when I say that. It's been said that I'm a nerd. Jason's over here going, yep, thanks, buddy. Yeah, I appreciate it. Affirming. Yeah. So here's a nerd thing. When Utah, Idaho Southern Baptist meet for their convention in October, the man that moderates the meeting and everything like that, right, I'll be standing just to his right with a notebook, and I'll serve as the parliamentarian for that meeting. That's weird. That's weird. That somebody's standing there that understands Robert's rules enough to help carry out a meeting, right? And make sure it's done in the right way so that we don't do things that are dumb. That's the whole role of the parliamentarian, is to hold the dumb quotient down as much as you can. Make sure things that are done legally, right? And within the rules of meeting. And you got to be just a little weird to be the parliamentarian of any kind of. Why are you laughing, Mike England? I can't help it. Okay, so I'm a nerd. You understand this, though. You get this, Mike. You get this. So as I read what's going on here, I kind of cringe because it's like, that's not how they're supposed to do it. I mean, I know enough about Jewish law to know this is not right. Number one, the high priest begins to question Jesus, and there's been no charge leveled against him. Not at all. And the way these proceedings should have begun was someone rise, make a charge against Jesus, and that's not sufficient in and of itself. There should have been then witnesses that would corroborate what that charge initially was, to prove that there's a reason here to even be having this trial. Then and only then would you begin to question the person who's been charged. Now that's Jewish law at the time. That's the way it worked. So Mike the parliamentarian weirdo is nerd is going, oh, he began by asking Jesus this. And I cringe at this. Okay, I just kind of cringe at that because that's not the way it should go. It's not normal. And it's clear from the very beginning. I said a moment ago, when we're having meetings like that, you want to make sure you do things in a legal manner, right? Because if you're not doing things in a legal manner, you can get in trouble, right? That means if you're not doing them in a legal manner, what does that mean you're doing? Illegal. So you can get in trouble doing that, right? So from the very beginning, it's clear from the very beginning that this is a unique situation, that they're not interested in anything that's fair. They're not interested in anything that's right. They're not interested even in the truth. We'll see that as we keep going through this. But Jesus' response really gets to the heart of the issue. Everyone knows what I teach. It's not a big secret here. I've preached regularly in the synagogues and in the temple where the people gather. I've not spoken in secret. I'm not John the Baptist out in the wilderness preaching here, okay? It's not like everybody's coming out to me. I'm walking right into the temple. I'm in the synagogues preaching regularly. And listen, when he said here, I've preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple was the domain of that high priest. Rome didn't have anything to do with what went on in that temple. The high priest and the way he ruled and led would absolutely have bearing on the day-to-day life of first century Jews. But the temple was his, complete with guards and soldiers that he could direct to act at his order. And Jesus is saying, you guys know what's going on, man. I've been teaching in the temple. In other words, hey, high priest, I've been teaching in your building. I've been teaching in your building. I'm not doing anything in secret. And there's nowhere that we get any idea in the arrest, in the trials and the interactions with the political leaders, even on the cross, where Jesus' tone is anything less than quiet and under control. We have it's not like when he cries out to the Father, but as far as his interactions with the people who would kill him, and his interactions with John from the cross, and his interaction with those who are crucified on his right and left, Jesus' tone seems to be a gentle tone, seems to be a quiet tone. We don't see any verbose, loud response or anything like that. But clearly, the high priest questions him. It's wrong. It's not legal. And this response back to him would have been seen as challenging the high priest. There's no way around that. It would have been, it's hard for us to understand, but there aren't a lot of things you say in a courtroom towards a judge that are appropriate other than yes and no and okie dokie. And if you start to challenge a judge, some of you are shaking your head no. I hope you've just seen this on television or something, but you don't challenge a judge in his courtroom. But Jesus is the sovereign of the universe. A little later on, when Pilate's going to say, hey, I can have you killed, right? And he's like, you couldn't if I didn't let you. I mean, that's Mike's paraphrase at this point. But so Jesus here, he's pushing back against the judge, albeit a judge who's acting out of order and a judge who's acting illegally. So Jesus asks the judge a question. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said. By the way, something else that's out of order. According to Jewish law, you could not self-incriminate. We've got the Fifth Amendment. I don't have to testify against myself. I can certainly confess to a crime, and they could have certainly confessed to a crime. It wasn't identical to our Fifth Amendment, but it was very much a precursor to what we would call the Fifth Amendment today. They were not required to testify against themselves. So even the question being out of order to begin with is still a question that Jesus has no legal requirement to answer, because Jewish law would not force you to incriminate yourself. So Jesus is asking a procedural question here, if you would. Why are you asking me this question? It's a procedural question. Ask those who heard me. They know what I said. We're going to come back to that in just a few minutes. Questioning the high priest, questioning the judge is tricky in any courtroom. And we see the response of it in verse 22. Then one of the temple guards, standing nearby, slapped Jesus across the face. Is that the way to answer the high priest? He demanded. I have so many questions about this verse right here. And this is outside. This is in the spiritual realm. And I don't know that I've ever thought about it quite as much as I have in the past few weeks. But we know that in the spiritual realm there are battles, right? We know that the forces of God, He is the King of heaven's armies. And we know that His angels, they do physical spiritual battle with the demonic, right? We see that in the book of Daniel when we studied that a few years ago. We see that in the book of Jude. We see it other places in Scripture where in the spiritual realm there is a spiritual battle. I just wonder if the curtain were pulled back for us, if we could see what the spiritual battles were in these last few hours of Jesus' life. Or did the king just simply look to his army and say, "Stand down"? And did they gasp when a soldier slapped him in the face? Like an open-handed, like an insult. You hit me in any way, shape, form, or fashion, I'm going to take it as an insult. But an open hand slap across the face. Guys, you're not going to take that real well, right? You're not. That's not how you're going to. That's not a good way to communicate. Unless you want communication back. The guard doesn't appear to be commanded to do this, but in deference to his role, in maybe the obedience even in his role. Remember, he's one of the guards. He's a temple guard. He serves at the pleasure of the high priest, and he carries out the work of the high priest. There's nothing here that says that the high priest said, "Hey, slap him." And I don't think there's any. I don't think that's the case. I think it's in a natural response in his role. That he's like, "That's not how you talk to the high priest." And then Jesus kind of responds even still with a question. Verse 23. If I said anything wrong, we're back to procedure, you must prove it. It's not my job. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me? That's a great question. If I've done something wrong, it rests in your work. It rests in your avenues to prove that and convict me. That's your role, not mine. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me? Now, he could have asked numerous other questions. Like, hey, there should have been charges first. Like, hey, there should have, but also, let's just be real with this. It wasn't legal to have a trial in the middle of the night either. There's all kinds of things going on here that are wrong. This is not official. This is a predetermined decision. We already know what's going to happen. They already knew what was going to happen. But if I'm right, why are you beating me? You know what's missing in these verses? And it just struck me, the response of the high priest and the response of the temple guard. There's not a response from here. These folks aren't answering anything. Jesus asked questions that at the very least exposed their methods were in error, but at the very worst exposed that their hearts were hard and they already knew what they were going to do. Their methods at least were wrong, and their motives, we already know they're wrong. They've already said they wanted to arrest him. They've already plotted and said they want to kill Jesus. Verse 24, and this is the second time this appears in John. Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. He didn't get anywhere with Jesus, did he? He didn't get anywhere. Partially because he's working outside of the system and doesn't know what to do next, in my humble opinion. We don't have, without some kind of this is how you do this, and when you're working outside of that, outside of any rule of law whatsoever, well, I'm going to send you to the high priest. Well, that's what we'll do. But then Annas bound Jesus. The last time they bound Jesus was when they arrested him. If you'll remember that passage, the temple guards, along with some Roman soldiers, comes into the garden. Jesus approaches them, very much in charge, says, "Who are you looking for?" They said, "Jesus." He said, "I am." They all fell down. He revealed who he was just in his words. And at the name of Jesus, every knee that was there bowed. They didn't all confess, but they all bowed before the great I Am. And then he looks at him and he says, "Now, who are you looking for?" And they said, "Well, we told you who we're looking for. We're looking for Jesus." And they bound him and they took him away. And I remember thinking then and saying then, and even thinking it now, does tying up the guy that walked on water, does that make sense? Does tying up the guy that calms storms and winds make sense? Does tying up the guy that called a dead man out of the grave? Does tying up the guy who healed someone born blind? Let's tie him up and take him to Caiaphas. Let me tell you something. It wouldn't have been a wise move, but when they slapped him, it doesn't say he drew back and then thought, well, no, I'll not hit him. And when they tied him up, it was because they let him. Or he let them, excuse me. When they tied him up, because those cords, that's really not going to, that's just not going to make any difference, is it? There's a couple of things that I want us to see in this passage and make application for us. Because you look at this and go, well, how do I apply that to me today? And I've got a couple of thoughts. I know you're surprised about that. Number one, Jesus is right. Sometimes that makes us angry. Jesus is right. Jesus was right about everything that was happening in the high priest's house. He was right about it. Why are you asking me? Has no charges been brought? Procedurally, Jesus was right about everything. But beyond that, Jesus is right. Jesus is right about everything. And it made the high priest angry. It made the temple guard angry. We're going to see in the next few weeks that Pilate's going to be terrified of him. Pilate is going to be afraid of Jesus. And he has what you would think would be full authority over that man's life or death. And he's terrified of him. Jesus is right And sometimes that makes me angry. I know I said us a minute ago, but I just thought I'd say me, and we could all think about it that way. I don't know about you, but I like to be right. I prefer it. And when I am right, as a friend of mine used to say, I get proud. You know, I'll just die on that hill and be stupid about it. I don't like to be wrong, and when I am, it disappoints me in myself. Somebody asked my dad something the other day, and he goes, well, I could be wrong, but it'd be the first time. And you can imagine him saying that. I don't say that. He was joking, of course, I'm pretty sure. Annas asked Jesus what he'd been teaching, but he already knew the answer. Some of his own lawyers had questioned Jesus, hoping to trap him. Some of his own leaders on the Sanhedrin court, the high court, had discussed Jesus and what they should do about him, and they knew what he was teaching. Let me just back up a little bit. Chapter 10, they wanted to stone Jesus for claiming to be God. They tried to arrest him. In chapter 8, they hoped to trap him by bringing a woman caught in adultery. Also in chapter 8, he claimed to be the light of the world while teaching in the temple. And they wanted to arrest him, but they could not. Later in that same chapter, he proclaimed, I am in the temple. And they wanted to stone him there, but he was hidden from them, the scripture says. Chapter 7, the temple guards were sent to arrest Jesus because he was teaching in the temple, and people believed he was the Messiah, and he talked them out of it. And they went back and they were like, to the high priest, why don't you have him? We've never heard anybody talk like that before. Which is the dumbest thing in the world a cop would say to his superior. Went to arrest him and, man, he talks good. That don't make no sense. They already knew what Jesus, they knew the answers to their questions. But you know what? Jesus is right always, and sometimes that makes us mad. Annas wasn't going to be satisfied because there's not an answer to the truth if you're not looking for the truth. They couldn't make a charge against Jesus because he hadn't done anything illegal. They couldn't bring charges against him because there wouldn't be witnesses. Hey, you healed a blind guy on the Sabbath. He sure did. Well, Jesus just looked back at him and said, you circumcise on the Sabbath, so meh. You work on the Sabbath too. You're guilty. Now, I know we're in church and it's a Sunday morning and or you're watching a sermon online and that means that we don't have these problems. This doesn't apply to us. But is Jesus ever right about something and it makes you mad? Now, we want to say no, absolutely not. I'm far more righteous than that. That's great. You ever argued with God before, anybody? Oh, wait. Oh, wait. Yeah. Apparently, when you ask that question, have you ever argued with God about something, it sounds out of context of anything else going on. Have you ever argued with God? That question seems like, well, who would do that and how's that going to work? And yet we've done it. Because God is right, Jesus is right, and sometimes we're going, but I don't see the problem, I don't see the issue, I don't want it to be that way, and we're not much different than these people asking questions right here. It's just not a legal thing, but it's a matter of our heart being in agreement with God. Whew. Jesus is right, and sometimes that gets under our skin. And we're His followers. Or you're in this room or you're watching online and you're not a follower. And this Jesus is right and that gets under your skin. That's what's going on with the high priest and all these other folks who want Jesus dead. He's right, and they can't handle it. You're looking for something else, and what you're looking for is your own way. What they were looking for is their own way. And you know what? When Jesus is right, and it bothers me, it upsets me, it disappoints me, I can do one of two things. I can either keep my story and live my story and live my truth, or I can admit He's right and I can follow Jesus. Those are the choices. When you put it in that light, who's right? Y'all are afraid to answer that. It ain't you. It's not me. There's been a time or two I've told Lord, it sounds so bold, but that, I really wasn't going to do such and such. You know who was right? Yeah, He was. I can either agree with Him and I can follow Him, and His story can be the story of my life, or I can keep living my story and living my truth, and I'm going to stand on principle. I'm right on this one, not the God of all creation. Again, out of context, it sounds stupid. Of course He's right. Of course He's right. But we want to protect our own space. We want to protect our turf. We want to protect our ways, the way we do things, or something like that. We want to remain mad. We want to. You can just start going down a list, right? We just don't like the way God's handling things. Whew. So where's my story not in line with Jesus? Where is my story not in line with Jesus? We need to remember this high priest was the highest religious position in Judaism. He's not, on outward appearance, a morally bad person. He is keeping the law to the best of his ability on the outward. He is leading the people to worship God and sacrifice. But his heart was hard towards obedience to the very same God that he led people to worship. So when I say, boy, we're here on a Sunday morning, and I know we're righteous enough, there would have been no one else in the land more righteous than that high priest in the eyes of the people. Better keep an eye on your leaders. I'm one of them. Jesus is right, and sometimes that makes me angry. So I have to ask myself, where is my story? Where is my life not in line with Jesus? And if we find those places, and when we find those places, the only response that makes any sense at all is to admit He's right and I'm wrong, to confess that and bring my story into line with the story of Jesus Christ. Second thing, restraining Jesus won't stop Jesus. Annas didn't get what he wanted from Jesus, so he tied him up and sent him off. Anybody ever not get what they wanted from Jesus? I've not gotten what I've deserved from the Lord, that's for sure. I've had people tell me over the years, I'm mad at God because He did not do this or He did not do that. Well, let's say it this way. Anybody ever wish the Lord would have done things differently than He did? I mean, you're not mad at Him. You're just disappointed in Him. That's what happened to Annas here. He did not get what he wanted from Jesus, so he just tied him up and sent him on his way. Did it stop anything? You'd like to say, well, he's tied up. You'd like to say, well, he's tied up and then he's sent to another trial that was a crazy thing. And then he was sent to Pilate and he's crucified. So, yeah, it stopped him till Sunday morning when he rose from the dead. By the way, tying up a man who's going to raise from the dead seems like, in hindsight, it's like tying him up just wasn't going to do it, was it? I mean, we killed him, we put him in the ground, we put a big rock in front of him. He's there, he's dead, he's buried, and he's got the biggest tombstone in history, and doggone it, on Monday morning or Sunday morning, he's not there. And the Sanhedrin have to meet again. We still do this the same way today. We try to put Jesus in a place where we're comfortable with Him. We're kind of afraid for Him to be in control. We want Him to behave Himself. We want Him to act like a Sunday morning God that we can sing to and just go on about our lives Monday through Saturday. And we don't want Him misbehaving. We don't want Him to expect anything from us. And so we tie Him. We bind Him. Somebody just in the last couple of weeks told me, said, man, I really like Jesus. I believe in His teachings. They're incredible. I just don't believe that whole God thing. He's not right part of the time. He's not right part of the time. I believe Jesus, but there's other ways to God. No, there's not. Or just in our hearts when it's like God is not acting like I want Him to act. He's not behaving like I want Him to behave. And come on, God, do things my way instead of yours. Or God says, Mike, this is what I want you to do. And I play Jonah and go, oh, you want me to go that way? Excuse me, I'm going this way. Anybody ever done that? Anybody ever clearly known what God wanted you to do and you did something else? Yeah. He just tied God up and said, you just wait right here. I'm out of here. Right? That prodigal son. Man, I was him once. I'm going to do it my way. I'm just going to let God do His thing. I'm not going to do what He's saying. That's crazy. He's done lost his mind. I'll restrain him and I'll have freedom. Till I didn't. And until I was pretty certain he had let me take the last step in that direction he was going to let me take. And I could either turn around or deal with whatever he had for consequences. Jesus is right, and sometimes that makes me angry. And Jesus doesn't always behave the way I want him to behave. He doesn't always ask me to do the things I want to do. I don't get my own way. And so when that happens, I'm just like the high priest. I'm going to tie his hands. I'm going to say, no, you stay over here. You behave yourself. And I'm going to keep doing this. And that doesn't stop him either. That does not stop him. I am so glad that he pursues us. I am so glad that he doesn't let us just go off. I am so thankful that when I was running from him, he had a string out there and I didn't know where it was, but it went so far and it was like, okay, that's the end of your rope. And I'm coming after you now. And we can go one of two ways. We can go the easy way or we can go the hard way. And that prodigal son in the book of Luke says he came to his senses. Yeah, he came to his senses. He got his brain on. And he realized, hey, you know what? He says it this way, there are slaves at my father's house that are doing better than I am. I'll go be a slave to my father. And of course, the father welcomed him back. He had restrained him with distance. He had restrained him financially. He had restrained that father so many ways. He'd restrained him. He'd bound him up communication-wise. All those things. And the father was there looking for him, waiting on him. All the time. Looking for him. And when he saw him, he ran for him. He pursued him. Man, I have bound God, and I have told him no. I'm so glad he chased me down. I'm so glad. You know what the big problem is in all these things right here? Have you noticed that I've said the word I probably 47 times in the last couple of minutes on application here? I'm what gets in the way. I'm what gets in the way. I want it my way. I want to protect my things. I want to be able to do what I want to do. I. Jesus is right and I'm mad. I'm going to tie him up. Didn't work for the high priest. It looked good on Friday. It was okay on Saturday. Sunday morning they had to call another meeting. Because the King of Kings and Lord of Lords was still King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he proved it beyond any shadow of a doubt by coming out of a grave. Why am I wanting him to prove it over and over in my life? Why don't I just trust him? Why don't I just trust him? Maybe you're not like me. Good. But some of you have kind of like, yeah, I've done some of that. Some of you, yeah, I've done some of that too. I've done some of that too. I want to come back and just ask this one question once more. Where is my story not in line with Jesus? Where is my story not in line with Jesus? Oh man, these guys knew what he taught. When they brought that woman, they said, hey man, the law says stone her. What do you say? And he didn't say a word so that grace could be administered. When a lawyer came to him and said, oh, talk to us about divorce here. And he said, well, really, that's your stuff. There's no divorce. There's no righteous divorce. And he looked at a bunch of people and said, you're basically committing adultery. They didn't like what he was teaching. It was inconvenient. It was problematic. Even his disciples. Okay, so we need to forgive, right? Like 7 times, because that's perfect. How about like 70 times 7, Peter? Because you take a lot of forgiving. And I want you to forgive like I do. Jesus is right, and I don't like that. My story doesn't always match up with his. But he's right. And he's righteous. And he's gracious. And his mercies are new every morning. And his grace is sufficient. And man, if we'll just bend our hearts, our minds, our will, our stubbornness to him, what a difference he'll make in our lives. And I mean that for believers. I mean that for unbelievers. I mean for each and every single one of us. Where does your story not match up with Jesus? Where is your story not in line with Jesus? And that's the place where you need to go next and say, he's right. And I need to be with him. He's right. And I need to adjust my truth to him. He's right. And I need to adjust my desires to his. He's Lord. And I need to adjust my thoughts that I'm not Lord of my life and let him be the Lord of my life. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes. I don't stand before you perfect, but as you can imagine, in preparing for this and asking those questions, I've had to ask myself some questions here. I've had to do some business with the Lord myself in this passage. And I think it's good for you and I both to ask ourselves these questions. It sounds so ridiculous to say, how has God made me mad?